entrepreneurs have traditionally kind of had this attitude, and this is a generalization, but kind of a fun one. Entrepreneurs are often those folks who say, I'm going to solve a problem, I just want the government to stay out of the way. I'd rather not interact at all. But there are times when you need to interact with government, and we've heard a little bit about that in the class so far. We're going to have a panel now to hear a little bit more about that. So to moderate today's panel, we have Brandon Pollock. Brandon is head of global affairs for 1776. He's been in the government affairs business for about 12 or more years, helping run campaigns, being an advisor to companies and politicians. And so he's kind of been in the middle of this kind of combination, this connection between business and government for a long time. At 1776, he helps with a lot of these type of issues related to government. So with that, I'd like to welcome Brandon Pollock, who will moderate the panel.
Thank you. So as I'd like to say, I'm actually a recovering lobbyist. So while Jeff certainly gave that very nice introduction, what I love is basically, my job is really having a foot in two worlds, the political world and the startup world. And I think what's especially really exciting to me, so I'm part of the founding team of 1776, is the fact that you have all these incredible world-changing startups that are disrupting all these sectors, and they're trying to improve, whether it's education or energy or healthcare or transportation. And so while they're all of course, interested in making money, more importantly, they're interested in how they can really have tremendous impact. So I know you've gotten to hear from some of my colleagues at 1776, and today certainly becomes the government day. The DC, you get the DC flavor here, and then I know you have kind of the state and local panel coming up next with my colleague David Zipper and everything. So I want to introduce our panel. We have a great panel today, some incredibly experienced politicos. So first we have Laurent Crenshaw, who leads government affairs for Yelp, runs all their federal government affairs. We have Eve Lieberman, who's chief of staff to Congressman Jared Polis, and Patrick McKenna, who's co-founder of NextRep, and he's managing partner at High Ridge Global. So that's all I have to see. All right, so let's talk about, so I guess first, so kind of to paint a picture a little bit, the way lobbying had traditionally been as far as tech companies, innovative companies, is it was always very reactive. So if you look at like Microsoft to Google to a lot of Silicon Valley companies, they kind of had the theory that Washington doesn't matter, we don't really need to engage there, get out of our way. But that's changing, right? So now more and more, and we'll get into a little bit, there was actually an interesting article in the New York Times today talking about why startups are getting in the lobbying game and just engaging in Washington in general. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but first I just kind of want to ask each of you, kind of get your take. I mean, the federal government plays, there's so many different layers to how to engage with startups, right? Like everything from immigration and patents, taxes, tax reform, so many different levels, right? So like, what do you see as kind of the role that the federal government plays with startups? Like, why should startups be engaging with federal government?
Sure. Start here.
We'll go down
the road. All right, that works. And it's great to be here and to see all of the faces in the room. I think that originally when we're talking about startups and the federal government, it's really about either, let me put it into a little bit of context, because originally when you had a lot of companies that were coming up that were doing such crazy out there innovative things from a startup's perspective and scaling so quickly, interacting with the federal government wasn't really sort of their go-to. It wasn't their first thought. And in part it was because you had limited resources and you figured that you would really direct those resources more or less towards creating the product and getting users to utilize that product rather than interacting with regulators and policymakers. However, as more and more when we're talking about startups and new startups that are coming up, they're getting into highly regulated markets and industries, and they're disrupting them. The
buzzwords.
The buzzwords exactly that immediately makes you into a startup. But in order to disrupt from a long-term standpoint, you need to at least have an understanding of the regulations that are out there, whether you are abiding by them or sort of, riding on the edge there. And also, ideally, you'd want to get ahead of the curve and actually communicate with policymakers about it. And so when we're talking about a startup, whether you're an internet company or doing something that's even more tangibly based, the federal government eventually will impact every app, or some portion of the federal government will impact what you do. Whether you're a drone company and you have to deal with the FAA, or whether you are selling a medical device product and you have to get approval by the FDA because you're actually making predictive sort of indications rather than just giving like blood pressure, pulse, or your temperature. Or even if you are an internet company that is providing certain services or products, and you need to make sure that you're in compliance with all of the different laws and regulations that the FTC might have, whether it's in regards to COPA, which is basically it deals with children's access to your app or device, and if you make your product available for kids under the age of 18, then you have to have particular restrictions there, and it's even more so for under the age of 13. And so there are a plethora of different ways in which the federal government can either hinder your growth, or if you approach it properly and early on, actually be at the very least a friend and possibly even a customer down the line.
Great. Thanks, Brandon, for having us and for welcoming us. My boss is Congressman Polis from Colorado. He's a serial entrepreneur. He founded ProFlowers.com and BlueMountainEcars.com. So he has a little bit of knowledge on how to deal with a lot of these issues that early stage companies face on the regulatory side. But not all members do, right? And so he comes to us from perspective, he's been sued, he's sued other people in the patent reform system, but a lot of members don't have familiarity with the complex laws that are involved with our patent system or our tax code or capital formation, just a lot of the issues that touch, all these startup communities. And so he kind of brings that voice from the startup community, and he understands where startups are coming from, but not all members do. So that's kind of the challenge, is really to educate different members of Congress who, aren't familiar with really the digital economy, some of them. And a lot of these entrenched interests have kind of, if you see kind of in the SOPA-PIPA debate, you have, the internet economy on one side, and then, a lot of the entrenched interests on the other side, and you have to educate those members about kind of the complexities and like why it's so important, and what, what you need to do to keep like an open internet and a free internet for our economy for the future.
It's always tough going third, right? We put some good material on the table, I'm sure, looking for a discussion. But so I guess the thing I'll add is maybe a little bit of a framework when I think about this question, and I'll start with a definition. When we say startups, it's a pretty broad thing. I mean, is it two guys in WeWorks, or is it 700 people but still not profitable? Right? There's a spectrum of startup, real kind of seed level startup, and then you have your growth company that is maybe in a Series B, and then you have your mature company. They're all in tech. Maybe startup can really share this software is eating the world that kind of brings everybody back to DC, because now every service, every product has some regulatory environment that you have to deal with. And kind of laying out that as the framework, I would say, how does regulation matter to each one of these stages? So kind of at the seed level startup, you're not going to spend any resources dealing with the federal government. But it's really important, as Ron said, it's really important for you to understand the environment. This is really important when you're building your business model. What am I getting into? Where's my edge? Where are the incumbents? Is it highly regulated? Is there a little piece here? Did something change that I'm taking? So you need to understand. And then it gets interesting, like where you guys are in the growth phase is where you can start influencing the environment. Uber is clearly influencing the environment in that fast growth, and that agency of having fast growth gives them a voice at the table. Plus, how much did they raise? 6 billion? 8 billion? So many buildings, it's hard to imagine. And then not to forget is like the last one, the mature innovation company is not is actually now using regulations to protect its marketplace. And the whole cycle is the same whether it's innovation and startups, but eventually that last phase, the company is going to be looking at how do they start building the moat around whatever franchise that they've built. And as Peter Thiel made very famous in his talks that he gave around his 0 to 1, is that capitalism leads to monopolies. And so the regulatory environment is incredibly important if you look at the whole cycle. So that's a little framework that I use to think about when should you and how should you deal with government.
Well, what's a really interesting point there is actually who's engaging Washington now. So like to that point, we'll get into in a little bit, is we are seeing companies like Coinbase and Zenefits, companies that you wouldn't think of traditionally that would have engaged in Washington now engaging in Washington. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but on the flip side, we're talking about the role, what is possible. But have you seen specific occurrences where the federal government, too much regulation becoming a burden on either startups or kind of tech companies? So we talk again going into a lot about we hear about patent trolls and there's a lot of issues out there. So where have you kind of seen that happen?
Well, in regards to on the regulation side versus just sort of the law and the legal framework not catching up completely to where startups are already at, where they're trying to think and go. A great example was the Jobs Act, I guess, that was passed back in 2013, but still I think we're waiting for the rules completely to be out there and implemented so that this whole new type of crowdfunding and crowdsourcing can be sort of properly utilized by startup companies. And it's just, the companies are already thinking about it. Obviously, there are already so many crowdfunding sites that have been around for years now that everyone in this room is probably familiar with and uses, but that the federal government is still trying to properly put a framework around. Same thing certainly goes for immigration as well. One of the biggest demand by any company these days that's a startup or in a technical field is for more, at the very least, H-1Bs, ideally permanent residency visas, green cards, and things like that. However, it's caught up in this larger debate on, obviously that's on the news every day basically, and it really is an impediment to further growth here. And now it's sort of a different, what that means I think is on different levels. When you're a growth stage company like Yelp, like Uber and others, one that has a big name ID but that's still sort of considered in this realm of startups, a lot of the people that are immigrants and whatnot and who will still try to work for your company. Access to talent, while difficult, you're still going to likely be able to get those folks. But if you're in the Series A startup, if you're still in that seed round, basically, trying to get those really good engineers, trying to get the people that you're going to need to help you scale and grow becomes incredibly challenging. And so, we've even had situations where we found the people that we wanted. We haven't been able to get them into the U.S. because we can't get enough H-1Bs for them. So now what do? Well, we still hire them, but we actually keep them overseas in like Germany or in England or somewhere else until we can finally work out their immigration situation. But if you're a startup just in your seed round, it's really tough, and it's something that everyone in Washington knows it can be fixed with, just a small change in the law, and that there'd be a tremendous amount of economic growth that comes out of it. But it's caught up in a broader debate that, by educating members though about your story is still very valuable.
Yeah, and so I'm gonna not really pick on you a little bit, but where there's so much gridlock in Congress, right? Like you're, to put it mildly. But we've seen these cases where Laurent used to work for Daryl Issa, right? And Issa and Polis known to work together tremendously. You see people like Senator Mark Warner and Jerry Moran in the Senate. So in this incredible era of gridlock, is it just causing more problems? And when it comes to when it comes to talent and immigration or crowdfunding is this really becoming incredibly burdensome?
Yeah, I think some of these issues transcend kind of party lines, and so our bosses worked on so many issues across the aisle. You know, whether it was maintaining a balanced copyright system within our trade agreements and copyright modernization on the SOPA PIPA stuff, they were really true allies. And so a lot of these issues aren't kind of party line, but yeah, immigration's tied up with a lot of, you know, extreme sides on both sides of the aisle, and so that gets kind of takes away from kind of the larger debate around it.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that Congress is failing to do on both sides of the aisle is updating a lot of our laws, including our copyright system, but also our, you know, modernizing our electronic communications privacy, and that really impacts the ability of users to kind of be able to provide the confidence to consumers about their privacy rights and what that means. And so right now you have one of my boss's bills requires an updating of email. It's called the Email Privacy Act, which is our surveillance laws, our electronic communications laws, and it says, you know, you need a warrant for accessing emails over 180 days, so the same as you need for your paper mail, and that can't get past us 300 co-sponsors on it, and that's like a bipartisan issue. Sometimes there's like these interests that are just, you know, a lot of the some of the civil agencies have some pushback to it, but it's some of these common sense issues still can't get across the finish line, even though they have broad bipartisan support.
Well, a very specific one that affects startups and has led to startups failing due to a law that didn't necessarily change but was difficult to manage around. And this is in the on-demand economy. So very much in the news is the independent contractor rules that are underpinning companies like Uber, for example. And you know, that's being litigated mostly in California, but it's a big issue. There are 53 million Americans, it's 34% of the workforce, that worked as a freelancer in 2013. That's quite a big group of people. Half of them, it was their primary income, and it's growing 10%. So it's a big constituency, but the rules around it are really driven by the federal rules. It's driven out of the IRS. It's a 20-point test, and then each state has its own rules that kind of derive out of it with some exemptions and some tighter or looser things, state by state. Very difficult to manage, state by state, right? So how does this affect startups? So on-demand economy is getting a lot of investment. There are two good examples here. So one is a company called Zirtual. This was a virtual assistance. It was stay-at-home, so people working from home being your assistant. And this company did very well. It had lots of customers. It was doing very well, and it was independent contractor to start. They switched to a W-2 or an employment model, and the company went out of business. It just happened. They had raised money, but the business model didn't work under the employment rules. Now, should they have done a better job of building their model to adapt to it? Who knows? But that happened. Another company called HomeJoy, which was a home cleaning service, they had independent contractors. They were getting a lot of issues about how they were going to manage to that, and they actually couldn't raise money with the overhang of potential litigations, with rule changes, and it went out of business. So those are two very distinct examples. Now, nothing has changed in Washington, interestingly, but the companies are dealing with this uncertainty. In one case, they couldn't handle the model change. In the other, the investors couldn't handle the risk profile. So I'm not advocating for what it should be, but that's an example where the rules in this is 53 million workers, right? So it's a big issue.
And going off of that, because there's another example, and you'll probably hear a lot about this tonight between what we're saying and then with the next panel that's state and local that's going to have, I think, someone from Uber on it. But another company that came to mind as you were talking was actually in 1776 for a little bit, Lux. So if you haven't heard of Lux, Lux is basically, it's sort of like an app that allows you to have a valet come and get your car and park your car when you get somewhere. So it tracks you to the location, they show up there with somebody, and you get in your car and drive it away, and you just tap on it, and then they come back and bring it back to you when you're ready to go. So they came to DC, were based in 1776, were getting ready to launch, and this was like a couple of months ago, and then right around the same time, they decided to change the status of their valets from being independent contractors to being W-2 employees. And so immediately, instead of going from 4 cities, which they had been in, to launching in another 9, they contracted back because they basically had to reevaluate everything and take a much slower approach and route now that they had to deal with the reality that was based off of, it was a rule change that basically happened at the Department of Labor that led to a reassessment of this, that kind of gave a little bit of a better understanding of the number of hours that you could work and sort of the direction of an independent contractor versus an employee. And even if you think about it, that's why certain times we've even heard like Uber, a lot of Uber drivers now also work for Lyft, and Uber's like, hey, that's fine, that's okay. Whereas before they used to just want you to work for one or for the other, but that gives a greater justification to the idea of them being independent contractors versus employees. So that alone, there's like, yeah, it's a fascinating situation, but if you're doing anything really in the on-demand space now, it's going to be huge, and it is a federal issue.
And it's one, frankly, that, I mean, you may have heard about it because of the on-demand economy, but it's also something that the presidential candidates are talking about quite a bit now. They're all jumping in on for different reasons. You know, they're on both sides of the debate, so they're, I wouldn't necessarily say pandering, but maybe pandering to certain segments because they're in the primaries. And you know, this is, you know, something that, you know, that frankly, I mean, we're talking about Congress a little bit, but something the administration, frankly, has been very active, right? Like how to engage with startups. I mean, you've kind of seen everyone, like President Obama going out and doing everything from Startup Day, which we graciously all created, to, you know, doing White House Demo Day, to a National Entrepreneur Day, but then creating things like U.S. Digital Service and, you know, 18F at GSA, and how you really innovate government. So while we're talking a lot about Congress, I mean, we'd be kind of remiss if we didn't mention, you know, the administration and the fact that, you know, President Obama has had to kind of do things unilaterally, I should say, to try to get some either new, like you mentioned, like Department of Labor. And so we're seeing a lot more of things like that, and maybe it'll change as we get into a new administration and everything. But we're not gonna get into the weeds, I promise. So let's step back a bit, right? Like let's talk a little bit about strategy when it comes to just engaging Washington, right? So you know, we kind of got into this discussion a little bit on what stage that, you know, depending what stage startups are at when they're engaging Washington. But we're seeing this real growth now. Like I mentioned a few of the companies before, but you know, from kind of your point of view as well, like why are some of these startups now, like I mentioned, whether it's some of the later stage or even some early stage companies now starting to at least either have a presence or starting to build relationships, like what, you know, from your perspective?
Yeah, there are a couple of different things here, and I think Patrick's point early on about depending on your stage is very important, because if you are an early stage startup and you know you've got your idea and you've got your funding intact, you shouldn't be afraid to reach out to policymakers. Obviously, it's not going to be the first thing that comes to mind, or to regulators. But I would say that you could almost treat them in a certain way, as in like another group of people that you're pitching, as if you were doing like a round of funding or something like that. Because you know that generally speaking, they keep that information to themselves, so they're not going to run out to their friends and you know give the secret sauce of your product. And also at the same time, you can build that relationship from the ground level that will really serve you well if and when you do scale up to being in a high growth stage. So maybe it costs you an hour or two. You reach out to your elected officials in the area, have those conversations, and figure out who else you need to talk to. But a lot of times they'll end up seeing the product. Maybe they understand it, maybe they don't, but they'll be excited by it. They'll love the fact that it's just happening in their area and that they can get behind it. And then you have a friend, and you have an ally, and you have a supporter. The one that, you know, didn't cost you anything, and that you don't have to worry about, you know, showing even necessarily a near-term return. So that's great. Then in the growth stage, or in a stage like where Yelp's at, we care in particular about maintaining a market and an environment that's very friendly to us. And in that regard, what we care about is protecting people's abilities to go online and to leave their opinions. without being unfairly threatened with lawsuits or with gag clauses in consumer contracts. And so we decided a while back that this was an issue that was important enough for us to really try to get clarity and certainty on at the federal level. And so that's what I spend a decent amount of my time doing, talking with policymakers, saying that this is something that could be better addressed at the federal level, and thankfully they've listened and introduced legislation in that regards. That's actually moving, because at the end of the day, they don't look at it as being a pro-Yelp thing, they view it as being a pro-consumer thing. So if you get to that growth stage, and you're trying to figure out like how to create a more harmonious environment, same thing that Uber's done. Uber says, look, people love our product. It's better than anything that was out there before. And you really want to go back to taxis? No. So help us to keep the market unto itself as being harmonious and beneficial for consumers.
Well, to touch on that a bit before I want Patrick's take on this as well, but before it, so you mentioned, because I was going to ask you about anti-SLAPP and everything, and how you went about. The bill is actually moving, something we don't talk about a lot in Washington. So how you mentioned how did you go about it? Did you go outside in addition to just what Yelp has done, either building any kind of coalition? Did you rally other companies around the issue? Like, so how did you kind of get it moving?
I mean, I think the thing that like you guys should all understand, as assuming you either go work for companies or develop them on your own, the principles behind the product that you're doing are going to be things that other companies will either be generally supportive of or able to relate to. And so it wasn't really about talking about this as being like, hey, Yelp wants to protect Yelp's users and their abilities to just go online and to just review things on Yelp. Talking about it in a broader context and sense like, hey, online consumer freedom of speech is a very important thing. It matters. It's just the First Amendment in a new format and in a new forum. And a lot of other companies and organizations and groups out there were able to agree with that, just from a fundamental principle standpoint. So then you find your other companies and other allies and go talk to folks in Washington as a unit. Because, you know, obviously a group of voices is much better than just one. And then if you can find your allies and work with them as well and continue to really sort of beat the drum on it, generally people will start to listen. And that's what happened in this case, thankfully, along with some other things that I won't go into just from like a timing standpoint. But and you know, once they started to listen, movement started to happen in Congress. Plus, the environment's ripe for internet startup companies in the conversation because they're seen as a little bit sexy right now. You know, no one wants to talk about oil or I don't know, or whatever else, you know, whatever other, like, yeah, other sort of incumbent industries. But the fact that this is a high growth, interesting, innovative industry right now means that policymakers want to be seen as being on the right side of it. So they're more eager to be your allies than not.
Patrick, I want to turn it over to you as well, because you've been a startup founder, like, so on the flip side, what is kind of that engagement for you been like? You know, I know you've done a lot of stuff at the state and local level as well, but how have you kind of engaged government whenever you've been on the early stage side of things?
Something that's really changed kind of in this kind of Web 2.0 versus the Web 1.0 is right now we're actually disrupting a lot of incumbents. Where in Web 1.0 is very much media driven, so it was like taking the money out of New York and bringing it to San Francisco. Frankly, as ad dollars were shifting, that was a big part of it. Or it was purely digital, like eBay and Amazon were very digital, even though, you know, Borders and a lot of the bookstores were suffering, but they didn't really have there wasn't really a constituency to like organize to fight. But when you start, you know, taxi companies you know, or cleaning crews, like unionized labor and licensed workers are now being disrupted, or small businesses. Like you guys are in small businesses. My point is, every congressman and every senator goes back to the district, and now they see a Yelp sign there, and they see, you know, TripAdvisor here, and they see somebody driving around and the taxi guy comes up and complains to them. And the point I'm making there is that I think one of the reasons why we're here more now is we realize that we have to tell our story before somebody tells our story for us. I think it's really important that there's this realization that like our technologies now, our innovations are so much more in the forefront of people's daily lives that you can't wait around, because in this case Congress is going to hear about it
whether you come or not. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's a little bit different. And then my personal, our approaches have, it's very constituent driven also. Like we either organize ourselves around an idea like net neutrality. That really organized the Silicon Valley, right? That's famously. Also around kind of encryption is another one that's really galvanizing the groups. For me, like personally, when we have business in, like, there's a few districts around the country. Like I have a company that's based in Portland, Maine. And so it's good for us to go spend time with the small congressional delegation that's in Maine because they can do something for us, and we're kind of unique in that we're a technology company, you know, with Silicon Valley credibility, and we're based in Portland, Maine. I've also seen this in Miami. I've invested in a couple companies in Miami. So there's also a community organizing there, and now I'm sure South Florida, and even Florida, congressmen are starting to hear from tech that they wouldn't otherwise have heard. So it's changing quite a bit.
And so with Eve, so going to the flip side of things, with you being on the Hill and everything, how are members? I mean, you mentioned, like your boss is a little different than a lot of members of Congress who need a 101 on a lot of things related to the innovation economy. You know, I mean, for us, example, we had a member come over once who just kept saying, so all of your startups in 1776, they're focusing on selling to the federal government. I said, well, no, actually not. Very few of them are here because of the federal government, but that it came back to that like 3 different times. So it took a while to kind of settle in and everything. But how are members of Congress engaging with startups? From your boss to just kind of just differently, what has the activity been like on the Hill, whether it's been members, it's been Hill staff, really kind of that proactive strategy?
So I mean, members deal with it in different ways. We have something called, Startup Day across America, where we encourage bipartisan members to kind of go visit startups in their community and learn about all these issues that are facing them. And there's different groups that bring different startups to the members. There's different, if you're a constituent company, you meet with your member, that's an in right away, and they want to hear from you. And some people are better about reaching out to the community and doing small business roundtables with startups and versus others. But if you don't have a seat at the table, like, you're not part of the conversation at all. And I was just thinking of an example with Bitcoin and with an industry that some people aren't really familiar with members of Congress. And if you don't have that interaction with members of Congress, then something bad can happen. Like they inserted some language in an appropriations bill, which basically said that the FBI had to do a study on the risks of this cryptocurrency, and because people didn't understand it, it wasn't like the risks and benefits. It was
Did
like
Visa put that in?
I don't know. I'm not saying. So there's because of those interests that already are aligned with members of Congress. If you're not in the room and explaining what this digital currency is and the value it can have for members of Congress and their communities, then you're not part of the conversation.
And members are, and to Laurent's point earlier, I mean, startups are a little bit sexier right now, right? But like, members seem to be a little bit more eager and willing to, if it's a startup in their district, like what we're trying to do with Startup Day across America, getting engaged with startups, incubators in their districts, but we see more of a kind of willingness, like, hey, this is a startup from our district, they're doing something that's very innovative, we should be meeting with them. Right? Like, there seems to be kind of almost a two-way street more or less these days, that members, they don't know what startups necessarily are. They might be like this unicorn, actually, for better term or another. But there seems a general curiosity, which is actually very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, going back to the on-demand economy, they see the value in having like this Uber and Airbnb and the flexibility that it provides. I'm speaking from the Democratic perspective. The flexibility that it provides.
This is a nonpartisan panel.
Nonpartisan. I'm not speaking for my boss. But they see the flexibility that some of those industries provide for different workers with flex time, and if you're a working mom, you can have flexible hours, and so they're kind of interested in that kind of new model. And yes, it's sexy, but it also provides kind of a new framework for our economy. And so they want to make sure that industry also has affordable health care. If there's retirement access for those industries too. If there's paid leave issues that need to be addressed. Like, there's a lot of issues that they want to be kind of involved with because they see it as a new model and a new growth area.
And another thing I'll point out too is with members of Congress specifically, even if there isn't specific legislation that's going on, they're an incredible asset to have on your side, right? It could be media related. They can shine a spotlight on what you're doing. They can connect with other members.
Yeah, I was just thinking a little, I do, just because as we were talking up here, it made me think about the 23andMe example, which is kind of like the shining, glaring example of sort of a company that tried to be disruptive in a particular industry, but didn't really take account of the regulatory challenges that were there. 23andMe, they're the ones, $99, maybe it's more than that now, $199 genetic test. But when they first started, they were also giving analysis as you might, be a carrier for this disease versus that one. And the FDA basically said, hey, you shouldn't do that. And apparently folks at 23andMe ignored the initial letters that came in until they finally got the bad letter from them saying, if you don't do it right, if you don't desist and stop that activity right now, you're going to be in serious legal trouble. So 23andMe, that basically stopped what was sort of the bread and butter of that company for 2 years. For 2 years, they basically have been dealing with that, and only just now are they finally getting approval from the FDA on certain predictive and prescriptive applications that they can do based off of your genetic information. But if they'd done some of the sort of the legwork that we're talking about beforehand, to at least have had champions in Congress beforehand, because I don't believe that they hired or had anyone internally within the company who'd done any of that outreach beforehand, they probably would have encountered less of such dramatic pushback. And that's kind of like, that to me is always what comes to mind is when you run into the regulatory wall and you either go out of business, or in their case, they had a lot of funding, especially from Google Ventures and others, that allowed them to at least go through this process and wait it out. But you don't want to be that kind of a company if you can help it.
And even now, you're seeing not just the individual startups, but a lot of incubators, right, engaging with the administration and members of Congress, not necessarily because they have legislation that they're focused on, but because there's stuff they want to monitor because their members might care about it. So 1776, for example, we don't advocate on behalf of specific legislation. We're not out there lobbying. That's not what we do. But a lot of things that I do, which is actually how I originally met both of these two amazing people, was kind of...
We just met tonight.
We just met tonight, so you
There's no beef there. Yeah, there's no beef there.
But it was an example of, we're not trying to do that, to legislate, but the idea is this is what we're seeing that's very impactful all around the country, whether it's startups in all these highly regulated sectors, whether it's education, energy, healthcare, transportation, and others, or agriculture, as we're seeing now, farmers using drones and all sorts of other things. So we're seeing a lot of startups that are really deeply impacted, and for members of Congress specifically to want to engage with the incubators, it's a great just a great connection point, basically. Hey, there's these really interesting startups that are doing amazing things in Cincinnati or Detroit or New Orleans and all these other cities. Hey, this is how we can help connect you with some of those really interesting startups in that state, in that district. So there's a lot of things that we've sought to do to help members of Congress specifically, really more on the education side of things, and frankly talk about a lot of trends on specific issues. We've talked about what are some key policy issues that startups might care about. It's really how do you grow, what are the public-private partnerships that really go into growing the startup economy, right? I'm sure some of the other classes we've talked about, building startup ecosystems or will, but policymakers and members of Congress specifically, it's not just state and local leaders, but members of Congress play a very effective role in that as well. So I wanted to, I know
Brandon, I got a question for you.
I was going to get into the question and answer session, so it's a perfect segue.